The Heretic is a podcast centered around radical and heretical viewpoints given a certain topic. Topics are wide-ranging and not expressly restricted to comparative religion, technology, society and culture, or the occult. The series focuses on people who not only critique incumbent systems, but who also present new modalities and frameworks. I'm Holly, and welcome to The Heretic. David and I grew up in market-obsessed households. This is why our first episode is on markets. Marketplaces are a mystery which caused the world to turn. Nobody on this planet knows markets better than my friend Brian O'Kelly.
My name is Brian O'Kelly, and I'm the inventor of many of the technologies that make programmatic advertising possible. I was the founder and CEO of AppNexus, one of the largest independent advertising technology companies, through its sale to AT&T last summer. I'm here today to share my experiences at the intersection of privacy and competition. As a consumer, I see firsthand how my personal data disappears into the online void. As an entrepreneur, I watch Google use its bundled services to unfairly attack my startup and cripple our growth. These experiences are united by a common thread. The internet giants have no incentive to address privacy issues without competitive pressure or regulatory oversight. And that's why we're here today, to figure out a way to rein in these massive internet companies, to protect consumers, and to preserve startup innovation.
Today's patron heretic is Karl Marx. Marx will set the meditation for today's episode on markets. Marx defined a commodity as the product of human labor for sale in a market. Fundamentally, Marx asserted, markets obscure the social relationships and processes of production. Now, capitalism doesn't create markets or commodities or money per se. Capitalism combines them in a way that benefits the capital accumulation process. Surplus value, created by workers and embodied in things that workers produce, is extracted as profit. In Capital, Marx delineates two spheres of capitalism. The first is the sphere of circulation, the marketplace, which only trades commodities but does not create value. The second is the hidden abode of production, also known as the sphere of production, where value is made through the transfer of human labor into commodities. The secret of profit-making in the process of production is often opaque and obscured to public understanding. The Deleuzian turn is that capitalism not only configures the field of production, but also the field of desire, entertainment, and leisure via social media. This is why identity has become so important for cultural production and politics in the 21st century. Brian is a serial entrepreneur, marketplace inventor and technologist and advisor based out of New York. So Brian, who are you, what have you built, and what problems are you solving?
I am an inventor, I guess. Probably most impactful so far in the world for creating this idea of an ad exchange, an online ad exchange where when a web page loads, in the blink of an eye, we can auction off this little ad space to the highest bidder. And of course, this plays directly into what you were just talking about, is the sort of hidden, invisible marketplace, the market that connects you as a consumer of content with all of these companies who are trying to monetize you, to turn you and your identity and your behavioral history into money. It's funny because there's a way to look at this where I am an incredibly successful entrepreneur and I had this huge impact, and tens of billions of ads a day were created through this process. But I think the downstream effect of this, if I look back on what I've created, I do think that I've seen firsthand how markets have both positive impact and this huge hidden negative impact on the world we live in every day.
Why do you think modern capitalism is so obsessed with identity? And specifically, why does capitalism care about the identifiable characteristics of person A as different from person B for these downstream activities like advertising?
If you think about a person, we are multidimensional, complex,
maybe even quantum mechanical conscious beings. Very hard to create a product for that kind of complexity. And so it's much easier to reduce a human being into a set of characteristics, a race, an age, a marital status, what we call identity, at least in modern capitalism, is a way of labeling. I mean that in a machine learning label set kind of way. I also mean that in a intersectionality kind of way. We reduce to these characteristics, which allow what we talk about as mass personalization, that this product is perfect for you, but not you, Holly, you, all the things that you check off on these lists. And so it's a way for capitalism to almost manufacture, produce things that are for you, but not for you as this wonderful, complex entity, but the things that you reduce to. And it's very profitable because we all feel like when we log into, say, Facebook, that this news feed is just for us. And of course it is, but it's not really me. It's this reductionist view of me through this identity view. Profitable and terrifying.
And so, of course, you have a lot of experience in this space. I'd love for you to talk about Right Media, where you stumbled into the ad and data exchange. What went right and what went wrong?
The problem I was trying to solve at the time seemed like a important and good problem. So you have a publisher, someone who makes a website, and this applies to podcasts or to videos, whatever. Let's just use a website. And there's all these advertising networks. So people who want to put ads on your site to help you make money. And let's say you're running an independent, blog. It's good if you make more money. And I realized there was a structural inefficiency, which was that you had to choose up front which ads to place without knowing how much they'd pay. And I said, why don't we connect all this together? Why don't we run this real-time auction that I mentioned so that we can see who's going to pay the most before you put the ad on the page? That was the simple innovation. Mm-hmm. To do that, we send a cookie to each of these players. And that cookie is this sort of identity we're talking about. Now, it's anonymized. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just some numbers and letters. But it allowed each of these networks to track me as a browser across the internet. Here's the mistake I made. I was sending these sort of bid requests, if you will, like, hey, what would you pay? Whether or not they bought the ad space, whether or not their ad was placed. So that means that everywhere this auction technology exists, we were sending this information to more and more advertisers. If you think about that at scale, if there's 1,000 participants, that means the auction has more participants, the publisher makes more money, but that same information leaks out to more and more participants. And so what happens is we facilitate the creation of now a data exchange where people seeing this information say, well, why don't we turn this into profiles? Why don't we sell it to each other? Why don't we connect into data brokerages? Why don't we put all these pieces together now that we have effectively access to bid on every human, on every browser, on every website in the world? We've done this financially liquid thing. Like most financialization, we have created value because publishers did get paid more. Advertisers had ads with more granularity, but at what cost?
Your reaction to that question, I saw a little bit of an eye roll, which is fantastic because it leads well into my next question, which is, fundamentally, how did your experience at Right Media shape data policy at AppNexus?
So at Right Media, we're a scrappy little startup. This is right after .com. We didn't know what we were doing. We had no idea. And so when we stumbled upon this way of connecting these ad networks, I mean, if you look at the patent I filed, it's called, you'll love my naming, linked networks, because we linked the networks. Someone else figured out to call it the ad exchange. Now it was called programmatic advertising. I saw an article this week that said, let's just call it advertising because all advertising is programmatic. So the thing we realized, though, is that this data sale and resale was risky from a privacy legislation perspective, and it didn't feel good. And I know that seems like a silly way to set a company policy, but I felt like we had a privilege, if we were successful at AppNexus, we would have a privileged role where publishers and advertisers would trust us to build the technology to run their advertising, and that we should not profit from or create value from all that data that flowed through us. So we tried to be, we said we would not create behavioral profiles. We would not sell data as a company, but we would allow our partners to push data through our system. So it's like, it's better than nothing. I mean, a really aggressive policy would have said, we won't play with anything personally identifiable. I think that would have been very difficult with everybody else, Amazon and Google and Facebook and all of our competitors being wide open to it. But even in the beginning, even in 2007, we were thinking, like, what is our role in this? Like, what should we be doing to make a market that's better?
In 2019, you actually testified in front of the US Senate at a hearing about privacy and competition in the digital ad space. What did you take away from that experience?
Today, like right now, we have Google, sitting there trying to defend themselves. This has become real. Like then it was more of an investigation. Now it's like there's likely to be antitrust proceedings. I have totally mixed feelings. I mean, we sold AppNexus to AT&T in 2018 because we did not see a way forward without a major partner that could leverage its assets to take advantage of our technology, which is just a fancy way of saying everybody else had more data than we did and more scale than we did, and being an independent with principles was not going to work in the modern age of tech giants. And so going to Washington, I mean, very intimidating sitting there in front of all these senators, to be clear, and saying basically that, I think my favorite interaction of this was talking about whether a consent notice was sufficient. So like in GDPR in Europe now, every time you go to a website, it says, do you want to accept cookies or not? Yep. And I said to one of the senators, I think Lindsey Graham, I said something like, imagine that you walk into a bank and it says, do you want us to steal your money or not? And he's like, that's not funny. And everyone else laughed. And it was funny because it actually is the question. It is, why are you asking if you can steal my data? Like who says yes to that? Yep. And of course the irony is every time I go to a website, I just say whatever. I know better. And I think that was the terrible part of that hearing, was realizing that governments are so underpowered, not just with antitrust or privacy, but the intersection, that privacy is beneficial to first parties, meaning that Google, because you use Gmail, already has your permission. They don't have to ask. Whereas if you go to, I don't know, Axel Springer, a wonderful newspaper in Germany, they have to ask because that's not your email address. And that to me is the real challenge we face, is that if we expect governments to regulate markets, we are not giving them the tools or even a framework to think about that. Like this millennium does not have a framework for either competition or privacy thinking that we can intelligently apply.
I want to now drill into a very timely topic, and that is the TikTok, Oracle, and Trump situation currently unfolding. Can you please just trace a brief history of the online data broker and what's going on and what Oracle is doing?
Well, it started actually in the late 90s. There was a company called Abacus that was creating these. It was actually an offline data brokerage that was pushing this into the online world. And they tried to merge with DoubleClick, which was the biggest advertising technology company in the world, and the government broke it up, which I think is super ironic. So then DoubleClick goes private, gets bought by Google. So now Google buys DoubleClick. I don't know what happened to Abacus. Never heard of it again. Then, because I had invented the data exchange at Right Media, we see a bunch of these sort of second generation programmatic data companies called data management platforms, Blue Kai, Data Logic, a few others, and Adobe buys one, and Oracle buys Data Logic and Blue Kai and creates something called the Oracle Data Cloud. Now, the way these businesses work is that their idea is they're the connection point between identity, like what cookies or emails is associated to you, and all this marketer data, plus a bunch of third-party data. So the offline data brokerage that knows that at your address, you subscribe to these magazines and have this size mortgage and whatever, take that offline data and plug it into your email address or cookie, take all this online behavioral data and plug it in, and create this really powerful profile that they'll sell to advertisers. So if you want to buy someone's marital status or number of kids or any of these other commodified reductionist things, Oracle will sell it to you. And this is a multi-billion-dollar business. And Oracle has done a great job operating it because they have the identity links, meaning they can map from email or from ad ID or whatever to this data, and they're plugged into all these big advertisers. So that's the history of how Oracle got in this business. I think it's pretty interesting that we're now, at this moment, seeing Oracle get involved with TikTok. And a lot of people have said, like, this makes no sense. I don't trust Oracle. Why would they want to do this? To me, it was totally obvious. The reason is because if you want to run a data brokerage online, this identifier of how you identify a person is tied to something else, a cookie, an email address, a physical address, or an ad ID, which is something that Apple and Google have created to tell what your mobile phones, which mobile phone you're on. Apple in iOS 14 is threatening to take that away. So no longer will brokerage be able to know what mobile device you are. So this is a huge hit to their business. The way around it, if they happen to own a highly popular mobile app that you have to log into, is they could use the login from that mobile app to unlock who you are, what phone you're on, and connect into these profiles. So if you're running a big data brokerage business, it's really simple. Advertisers plus data plus identity equals billions of dollars of profit. And TikTok replaces or augments the Apple ad ID. So it makes total sense for Oracle to want to own a logged in product. However, the fact that most TikTok users I know are not, my age, I don't want to tell you how old I am. I have not made a TikTok video yet. There are some really concerning aspects to this that are not even about like Oracle's corporate motives. It's about, what does this say about their ongoing strategy? Obviously, there's the Chinese government aspects. And you mentioned Trump, which is, why is he involved? And what is his incentive for wanting Oracle to monetize a bunch of kids' data as opposed to China using it for whatever surveillance or other seditious purposes that we think they might? It's a very odd trade-off to want one more than the other.
Regarding you not making a TikTok video yet, there's always time, Brian. So
no, only like 2 more days until it's taken off the app stores. So I was thinking I would download it right after this.
You might have to, yeah. But why don't you think everyday consumers know Oracle as a data brokerage?
Well, it's a B2B business. I mean, data brokerage is not a consumer thing. This is, Oracle, which is this big unknowable company that does database and clouds and things. It's an enterprise software company selling to big advertisers. And this is what happens when you click that accept button. One of the things you're accepting on consent is, let all of these hundreds of companies plug into my identity. Oracle's a big part of that, probably the biggest player in that space. And every time you click accept, you're basically saying, yes, Oracle, you can monetize me.
And going back to the Chinese government and Oracle, TikTok, Trump situation, I think it's an uncontroversial claim to make that, TikTok is being used to gather information on people. ByteDance is likely an intelligence asset for the Chinese military. Why is the commodification of identity and surveillance problematic in this context?
Well, I think this goes back to a really long-term mindset. I think even, like my strategic viewpoint is years. If I get to decades, I feel really good about myself. One thing you mentioned to me as we were talking before this is that, the Chinese government can take 100-year look forward. And if you think about, I've been reading about the Opium Wars.
Yeah.
And how when the British wanted to make inroads into China, they ran out of silver. That the silver they were getting from the exploitative three-way triangular trade with the US, Europe was running out of silver. And they had to find something else to use to buy tea and stuff, commodities from China. Like, oh, look, India has opium. Let's sell opium. And when China said no, I think it was the Qing dynasty was like, we don't want opium. Then Britain sent their military in and started bombing them and forced them to allow opium. They still said no. That's how they got Hong Kong. And they still said no. And there was like multiple opium wars. And finally, they got to push their opium in, which was terrible, of course, for the Chinese people who are now hooked on opium. But think about how destabilizing that is for a country to have an addictive substance used as leverage. I mean, I know I'm talking about hundreds of years ago, but in some ways, getting our kids hooked on, these social media applications and plugging into probably very subtle ways of changing their behavior, of maybe this is why white kids are stealing black kids' dances and taking credit for them. This is all a Chinese plot. I'm not going to go there, but it does give a pretty interesting way to start subtly manipulating how a generation grows up in America. And that algorithm that China doesn't want us to have, why not? Algorithms aren't like that fancy. I mean, this is not like, are you telling me there's like machine learning about which dance you're most likely to like on TikTok that I should know? Or is there something in there that we do need to understand? I'm really, really curious, and you got me thinking about this, of like, just how subtle and seditious is this? Or alternatively, this is all one big crazy conspiracy theory and we're barking up the wrong tree. That's also possible.
For everyday consumers then, and perhaps even, children or young teens on TikTok, what does this deal mean?
Well, first off, it's not clear that there is a deal.
Right.
I don't want to get
political. The bid for the deal, yeah.
But I mean, we've seen Trump occasionally make promises or claims or threats or things that don't come to fruition. I think that, let's imagine that we do have Oracle getting effectively access to all the data that's spat out from TikTok as sort of one side effect. And another is that China maintains its access to this data stream and maybe some influence over the algorithm, maybe not. From a surveillance perspective, China's happy, if you believe that. From a commodification of identity and of entertainment, and everything else, Oracle wins. They solidify their position as a data broker. For the American public, what we have is actually possibly good, which is a beginning broad realization that we can't trust the apps on our phone, and that we can't trust our government to protect us on privacy, and that we can't really trust the evolution of this like privatized internet universe. Maybe this is a moment where people say, you know what? Like, I can't have TikTok on my phone. And you can't use it, kiddos, because I'm not comfortable with what it says about, how I'm being used. This could spark a revolution. Not like a overthrow the government revolution, but a change in our dynamic and our relationship with devices, apps, corporations, nations. I'm very concerned about this nationalization of technology and the internet. I think it's super dangerous and bad for humanity, but maybe if you're right about China and generational dominance, maybe we should be a concern. I don't know, but I think we're at a cusp of, this coming out in the streets, this coming out in ways that only Donald Trump honestly could do, because he's just made this such a bigger deal than it actually is. He's handled it so poorly, as with so many other things. We almost have no choice but to address it. Of course, completely against his agenda. So I almost appreciate that about him. He does everything so badly that we have to address it.
Do you think it's interesting that, Trump has actually used foreign policy to force the sale of a business to a U.S. identity brokerage? I mean, I think it's important to note that state actors are actually forcing these trades on the free market. It's not the diplomatic exchange of information or assets. It's actually the state brokering the sale of an intelligence asset like TikTok to another identity brokerage like Oracle. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
There's this guy in Russia called Putin, and he has these bros who he calls oligarchs, and he has these like nationalized assets that he likes to sell to his cronies to make sure that ends up in KGB hands. I mean, I don't want to give Trump credit for this. All you're doing is copying a playbook we've seen again and again and again. You're just really bad at it and running it in the wrong society. Yep. I mean, what I think is that this is crony capitalism. I think that this is anti-democratic. I think it's even bad capitalism. I mean, if you're going to be hyper-capitalistic, at least be good at it. I think that Trump is choosing the wrong enemy in this case. I think there's a lot of people that we actually should be much more concerned about than China, but that we are changing that dynamic and forcing China to see us as their number one enemy. We are causing a huge multi-generational impact to Silicon Valley in our tech space because we are forcing China to develop independent technologies, whereas otherwise they would have used ours. Everything about this is opposite to what's good for humanity, what's good for the United States, what's good for any kind of human rights vantage point, where if you care about what's happening to the Uyghurs, yep. Declaring trade war over TikTok makes no sense. No sense at all. We could do such good as a country in the world if we would even just get off of our high horse about TikTok. I know how dumb that sounds. If 6 months ago I said, we're going to go on a podcast and I'm going to start talking about how TikTok is destroying America's empire and our long-term hold on the future, the moral future of this world, it's TikTok, you would have laughed me out of the room. And that's where we are.
I would have actually. I would have been like, Brian, stop ranting about your conspiracy theories. I'm not going to touch that. Yeah. But I think it's a really good point to segue into the next section of this discussion. And seeing as we've now totally marketized everything, how can we stop this freight train to build better outcomes and systems and governance to just create a better world and society?
I don't know. I mean, first of all, I don't have all the answers. I feel like a humanist vantage point is really important here, which is it's hard not to think about humanity as a civilization, as people who share the same planet, as kind of this greater body that we influence and say, okay, well, let's work backwards from what we can't do, almost like exploitation. We've been exploiting each other for millennia. You talk about slavery, but you also talk about forced labor. You talk about sweatshops. You talk about all these ways that we are, taking advantage of people. You can include the U.S. prison system if you like in that. Then we have sort of this idea that we're all on the same planet. We're not going to operate blindly across borders. Borders cannot change this humanist economy, meaning we can't say, let's outsource pollution to Indonesia because they have lower wages and we can say it's cheaper to produce there because that smoke stays there. It doesn't. It flows across the Pacific to us. So that means a change in our approach to nationalism. I think there's a lot of inequality things we have to ask about, and that's again where these tax shelters and tax havens create this deep sense of unfairness, that it's not just inequality, it's that the rules are different for different people. So going back to the markets, like the problem is we're not even playing in fair markets. We're not even close to fair markets. And I think that mindset that we take away the loopholes so everyone plays by the same rules are really important if you believe in markets. And I think this idea of empire kind of comes back to this core thing. Like the tech giants operate within a set of rules. They're building markets. I have a hard time when you ask me if, like, say, Amazon controlling e-commerce is bad, right? I don't have a moral sense of Amazon and e-commerce, but if you dig down a few layers and ask the questions of how exploitative are they? How are they reflecting, these ideas about a better, more humanist economy? We can have a conversation and come to some interesting answers and think about how government plays into that, think about how compensation plays into that, how tax plays into that. All of these things kind of come together into almost a philosophical conversation about the structure of markets, the structure of ownership societies, the structure of inequality, the structure of what are our basic human rights. Should we pay for healthcare or not? Should we, I don't know, have food or not? I mean, we want to provide food to everyone on the planet or not? I mean, I do, but that's not how we're structured today. We're not asking those questions. And I think that's where maybe over the last 50 or 60 years, we've gotten lost and we've stopped talking about how we want society to be. And we've started to talk about tech giants as an inevitability, as something that happened to us. I don't think that's the case.
I was doing some research for this discussion, and I happened across your old blog, and I'm going to actually read an excerpt because I thought it was a really lovely summary of just your 16 years pioneering ad tech. Okay, and you wrote, "Our creation, programmatic advertising, changed the world. We have made progress toward harnessing the power it unleashed, but there's still so much more to do. We must protect the privacy of our citizens and at the same time find a profitable, open business model for journalism. We must prevent the use of advertising as a vector for disinformation, hate, deception, and fraud. We must build diverse, inclusive companies. We must find ways to educate a much broader swath of the population so they can participate in the digital economy. In sum, we must create a better internet and a better world." And I love that. I thought that was beautifully written, Brian. And so in the context then of the digital economy and the marketplace, how do we redesign markets that work for everyday people?
Well, I think we have to start with everyday people, and I think that an ivory tower or Silicon Valley or, privileged white guy answer to your question is likely to end up in similar paradigms to what we've seen. So first, I think that has to be a different process of answering that question. I think we need more representation by different kinds of people in government. I think we need to see the conversation be around what outcomes do we want? Do we want a world where more people have enough, or an outcome where, a few people have too much? Can we agree on an enough, actually? And I think if I were to say plenty as opposed to scarcity, or plenty like being enough, I think plenty is a word that comes to mind a lot here, which is we do have plenty. There's no scarcity in a digital economy. So why are we so unequal in how the outcomes are spread around? I think that heritable wealth is a problem. I think that a lot of the way we operate is how much money can I get in this lifetime so that I can give it to my kids, either by putting them in private school. Caveat, my daughter goes to private school. I feel guilty about that. How do we pass on as much wealth as we can to our families? But that means I'm always trying to get more, even if I can't even think of how to spend it. What if that weren't the case? What if there were not inheritance? And forget how that happens, but that when I'm gone, it's gone. Well, what's the motivation to make all this money? Why am I fighting so hard for tax loopholes and tax havens and all of these things? Does it really matter to me anymore? I wonder if we take away this motivation, this like keeping score, or maybe we do, make as much as you can and it's gone. But think about the corporate motivation. For me as an entrepreneur, what if my motive function changes to make my investors money? I need the capital, but I don't need this capital way above the production sphere that we talked about. I just need enough to create and build and grow and solve. And then I measure myself based on societal impact. I measure myself based on these second and third order things. And I know you asked about sort of markets, but markets are built around firms. Firms are built around founders and executive leaders. If you change the incentives of the executive leader, if you change the way firms operate, you change the economy. The invisible hand of Adam Smith only works by these hands of people like me who run companies. And I think that's the the challenge is we need to fundamentally change people if we want to change markets. And systems and economies come from how we either enable plenty to be distributed, or we enable plenty to be kept tight, scarce by a few people. So I'd like to see markets that are trying to create, as I said, a better internet in that quote you read, but a better world. And let's judge and gauge our success managing and creating and facilitating markets by how widely we spread the fruits of that labor, by how much plenty we create, and change the little things. I mean, the idea of inheritance being an obvious one, of all the ways that happens that have created this systemic racism, this multi-generational injustice that stops. Excuse me, we can't stop it. I don't want to overlook it. I'm just saying that continued, almost like compounding impact through the generations is much harder to propagate if we stop this idea that my privilege makes my daughter privileged, makes her kids privileged, and we can look down in 5 generations and see that my kids are still having better outcomes than those whose great-great-great-grandfathers didn't happen to be successful entrepreneurs. That, to me, is the beginning of market change around different motivations by the people who drive markets.
Let's bring this conversation to the present day. What are you doing at Commodity, and what problems are you solving for?
Commodity is this new startup that a few of us created last year. And the fundamental fascination I have is this quote unquote real world. I've been in the internet for forever, and I really didn't have, and probably still don't have, a deep understanding of how all of the goods, the physical goods that we touch every day, are getting here. And so these supply chains that are, and sometimes like 5 or 6 layers deep, are completely opaque to me. Probably the same way that the internet's inner workings are opaque to most people who are browsing the internet or, playing on their phone. And so what we're trying to do is help manufacturers manage their supply chains and help them procure in a new, more collaborative way. So that if you think about, a lot of the information that's going up and down this chain is actually shared. And I've heard this called industrial IQ. I've heard this called supply cloud. There's all these fancy terms for it, but it really boils down to the idea that it's almost a collaborative process of connecting the physical movement of goods, the informational movement of goods, and the financial movement on top of that, all together in ways that create value up and down the supply chain. So sustainability is a good example. Let's say you decide in your smelter that you have outside your house, you're going to do solar-powered aluminum. And right now, if you think aluminum is a commodity, there's no difference between your solar-powered aluminum and my coal-powered aluminum. Well, but you see all these companies every day saying they want to go zero carbon. Not just that, Microsoft's not going to burn coal anymore. They don't want any carbon anywhere in their supply chain. So how do we help all the links in their chain make better decisions about how they procure? Can you get a premium price for your solar aluminum? Or do I start buying carbon offsets to make my, coal-powered aluminum effectively net the same cost as yours because yours has no inherent carbon tax? Do we ship via vessel or rail or truck? All these things become fundamental challenges when you have these big global supply chains. There's also a resilience question. What happens if, the person who knows how to run the plant gets COVID? Well, what happens? If this is all paper and pencil, not that it is, but, very manual tasks, we lose visibility. And so this is the moment where technology can start changing industry. It's like an industrial revolution around digital technology that is almost like bypass the real world, that it's so much easier to, build an e-commerce store than to help a major manufacturer with real world operations. I'll summarize by saying the biggest revelation to me is how smart and sophisticated and effective these manufacturing companies and their supply chains are. I think it's really dangerous when we sit in the technology world and think, well, we're smarter than you. It's not the case. It's actually that it's just we're solving different problems with different tools. If you're an SAP power user, you're my hero. Like, there's 300,000 screens in SAP. I don't know how anyone operates that every day. But if I can go in and help you make your company work better, your supply chain work better, and I can actually make the real world, that touches consumers, that touches producers, there's ethical things left and right as we talk about this. It is such an honor and opportunity to come make the real world better. That's what we do in a very long-winded and highfalutin way.
Are you focusing on one component of, the entire supply chain to build, more sustainable processes? How are you approaching this?
We're starting off by just approaching with a total learner's mind. Like, this is, help us understand your business. Our first customer is a manufacturer, a US manufacturer, who has been so incredibly open with us to help us understand every aspect of their production process, all of their facilities. A couple weeks ago, we did a call with one of their plant managers, and in the background of the Zoom, there's like trucks dinging and there's, copper melting and like there's this activity. And he said, before we start, I want to tell you, I hit my quota for like 38 months in a row. And last month we operated with 0.5% scrap. And I'm really proud of my team. And I was like, this is so cool. So we're starting with metal because it just happened to be what we knew the most about. What we're doing right now is just trying to really understand the real problems and opportunities and to try to have a systems thinking mindset. And also, as we've talked about, to have a broader stakeholder mindset. I don't want to make the same mistake I made 15 years ago at Right Media, where I invented something that solved the local problem, but caused all of these global problems down the road. I want to make sure that if I open Pandora's box, that I am right there to slam it back closed, and that we are really thoughtful about what the downstream impacts of our innovation are. And I think that joint respect we have for these manufacturing companies and for everyone involved in this real economy, we can, almost be gentle in how we innovate. To your point, galactic problem, super ambitious, want to change the world, but don't need to disrupt it. Don't need to do that in a way that causes more problems than we solve. That makes any sense.
We know that innovation only works if folks want to innovate. And I imagine some of these systems are pretty entrenched, obviously to fatten the margins on the marketplace as well. Have you encountered folks who, or even people within the industry that just don't want to innovate?
Innovation is so scary. It's not that they don't want to innovate. In fact, thinking of a particular person. I'm thinking of a particular person who keeps calling me and saying, I really want to do more with you. I want to innovate. I want to change my business. And I say, amazing. Okay, so here's the things that I can think of. Like, why don't we change how you do this? No. That would be strategically risky. Okay, why don't you not roll out this new technology system and let's talk about how we could change the fundamental basis? No. We can't do that. That's not an innovative dialogue. There is a joint openness necessary to get there. And it's funny because I feel like he truly wants to. He's just not willing to take the risk. There is a risk involved in any kind of change or innovation. And that risk makes a lot more sense when you kind of know the stakes. And I feel like if you're fat and happy and doing great, it's kind of not the right moment. That's why COVID was so great for our business, was because, I hate saying that, actually, it sounds horrible. There were some few positive things about COVID that helped our business, one of which was it was that clear and present, we have to change, we have to take risks, we can't keep doing things the same way we have. And that created that opportunity. I think that's the thing that a lot of innovation, that's the innovator's dilemma, right? Where if you're doing really well, you don't really want the risk. So that's what we're looking for. But I think no one said, I don't want innovation. Everyone's in fact said, I think this is inevitable. It's just more about when and where and how.
Bringing it back to our historical patron heretic of the episode, Karl Marx. What do you think Marx would think about your venture, Commodity, and how you're approaching the problem of raw materials, traceability, and supply chain?
One thing that I think is really cool here is that a lot of what happens in the real economy is production. That there are markets, of course, there's markets with indices for metals, there's ways you can hedge. A lot of those markets were created to help producers not have to take the risk of a crop, right? That you're not going to produce for 9 months, the price needs to be at a certain place. There are tools here that maybe Marx would be cool with, in the sense of like enabling the producers to create value for themselves with limited capital. I don't know. I think our venture would be kind of proof to him of the nature of commodities, that there are, like I think you said in the beginning, like capitalism doesn't create the commodities, it just connects commodities to this sort of capital accumulation. And I guess I'm really, really interested in and focused on production, manufacturing, transport, and financing. And that financing question is, if we don't connect these players to financing sources, they can't operate. Capital is necessary. And Marx would probably say, and capital is the root of all evil. So I hope that if we are as galactically successful as you said, that we bring a very thoughtful, philosophical, ethical, moral approach to how we help capitalize these supply chains and how we think about the impact that production has on the real world, on consumers, on, equality, on justice, all these things. I think Marx would at least appreciate the conversation. I don't know what he'd say.
Today, as we traverse the dystopian stages of surveillance capitalism, it seems we are living in an age where everything is marketized, from human attention and privacy to personal data and affect. The moments of our lives and aspects of our personhood have become commodities. The marketization of everything creates a terrifying auction mechanism that can steer civilization in directions in no one's best interest. And it kind of feels like we've engendered a headless horseman and are losing the ground beneath our feet. Headless in the sense that government has ceded control to the tech giants, and in the insidious way algorithms are making decisions with no moral sense.
In summary, I know these are complex matters, yet we are at a tipping point. If we address privacy and competition now, we can ensure decades of sustained internet innovation. If we do not, we risk seeing our economy, culture, and politics controlled by a small handful of all-knowing companies that don't act in the country's best interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm so humbled to hear your thoughts, and I truly admire the problems that you're solving at Commodity. So thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Holly.
Until next time, to all the heretics out there, awake, arise, or be forever fallen.